Hello, art historians. Today we're going to do our third video in our prehistory. We did the video one on Paleolithic, Neolithic, and the general timeline of how prehistory works. Our second video was on the Great Hall of the Bulls and in Lascaux. And this is our third video. So while you're writing this down, this is chronologically, according to the College Board, their fourth image, running horned woman. And I know that I marked this as Europe, and I know that Algeria is not in Europe, but I put this in here because it is on that northern border of Africa, and it's sort of stylistically much more similar to our European pieces than it is to our Southern African pieces, and that's why we have this here. So I'm aware that Algeria is not in Europe, but I just sort of want to separate them a little bit. So Tassili and Gir in Algeria, 6,000 to 4,000 BCE. And we're looking at pigment on rock. So this is a similar kind of painting style as we see in the Hall of the Bulls and in the caves at Lascaux and the caves at Altamira. But what is different here, clearly, we have made definite changes over time. So the Hall of the Bulls was 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. So this is at least 7,000 years later. And we see a significant difference in how the Neolithic people have moved towards this style of art. So you're going to see the same idea of the stone having been prepared with flattening and with sanding. We also see that there is a very much a what we call, and this is the first use of this phrase we're going to have, but it won't be the last. And the phrase is hierarchy of scale. And so hierarchy, it has to do with that size, how big things are in relationship to other things. And what we see with this concept of the hierarchy of scale here is that the one figure in the middle, the running horned woman, is clearly much larger than the other figures. And so that's really important that we see that. When we talk about these images, we have a tendency to talk about what makes them so important that these are the images of all of the images that exist that the College Board asks us to know. And so the reason that this one makes the list is this is the most defined human form of the late Paleolithic, early Neolithic age. And so she is a clearly defined human form. But we also see that there are lots of different things going on here. So let's talk about this. The entirety of the piece, it's almost 20 feet high by almost 10 feet wide. It's giant. It's much larger than life size, and so we have this just gigantic proportions going on. We also see that these figures are purposefully created to be dark-skinned humanoid figures. Humanoid, definitely based on human beings, and some people like to argue, well, it's pigment on rock, so of course they're going to be dark. Except the thing is that in this cave complex in Algeria, there are also what are clearly Caucasian figures. And so this is a stylistic choice to make these figures dark, to make them dark-skinned humanoid figures. What's interesting is while this area of Algeria is now mostly desert, at the time that this would have been created, it was very much grassland and very much pastoral rainy season, you would have, as we begin to move into the Neolithic era, we would have would have had domesticated animals. We would have moved our herds from one grazing spot to another. And with the rising of the rivers and creeks, with the seasons, we would have moved our herds to be closer to that, but we would have stayed mostly in one area. And so what you have is what is clearly a society that is influenced by the weather, because during that rainy season, we would have moved around and moved our cattle and our herds to those grassy areas. But then when the dry season began, they would have moved closer up into the plateaus of this Tassilian and Gir, and they would have lived up in the plateaus, up in these like caves in this area. And so we know that we're beginning to have a more fixed location, but there's also the idea of, in the dry season, moving to where there's more covering from the sun and sort of things like that. Now, what's most interesting about this is all of the different types of imagery that we have going on here. And there is a lot of really, really important, seriously major imagery going on here. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that with our running horned woman, we see the smaller figures behind and then the running horned woman over top. And so it makes clear that this was probably done in pieces, that the smaller figures were probably there first, and then the larger figure was created over top of it. And that then goes back to that hierarchy of scale. I should probably spell that for you. Hierarchy, Hierarchy, hierarchy of scale. The things that are the most important are bigger. Okay? The bigger you are in some of these early compositions, the more important you are. And you make the thing that's the most important the biggest thing. And so we realize that she must be incredibly important because of the size that she is, but also for several other things. And so let's talk about some of the imagery that's here. She's overlaid over top of the smaller images, which then shows that she has importance over top of them, because there is a style of it's called palimpsest, where people paint over other things. And we underscore how important things are by painting over top of the things that were there. And it's a way to say, this is now what's most important. So we have these smaller figures, but now we have this running horned woman. And we're not entirely sure whether she is human or she is wearing horns that would have been taken from animals. But we do see several things that are really important here. We see down here at the bottom another dark-skinned humanoid figure with a rainbow above. Okay, and so this concept of the rainy season. We see the running horned woman with all of the dots above, and we believe that this is probably indicative of rain. And so again, comes back to that idea of moving the crops, moving the herds around for the weather and things like that, and that the coming of the rain is really important. But then we also see the prevalence of this grass. Okay, she has grass that's tied around the top of her arms here, probably raffia, raffia, and this is like a dried grass. She has a raffia skirt, and she has raffia tied around her legs. Then we see that she has some sort of basket weave sort of thing covering over top of her hands. And so we wonder if this is an attempt to show movement with the one leg behind and the one leg in front, and the strings of the raffia being separated as her arms are moving. And so she's running. Now, what's interesting about this is it is a different kind of way to stand. You're going to stand with someone looking directly at you. Your two legs will be next to each other. They will be directly underneath your waist and underneath your chest, and your arms are usually at your side. What I want you to imagine right now is you're going to turn to your side. You're going to have You're going to turn to your left. You're going to put your left foot in front of your right foot so that it looks like you're walking. But then you're going to turn your torso. So you're going to turn at your hips and you're going to turn your torso so that it's facing forward. So your legs are facing to the left, looking like you're running or walking to the left. But your arms are facing forward. I mean, your chest is facing forward, but then your arms are sort of tilted so that you can see both of those arms. So they're out from your side. And it's very much what we call the Egyptian pose or the composite pose. And ancient people did this so that when you stand like that with your two legs separated, like you're walking forward, you turn at that waist, you separate your two arms so that you look like you're kind of a scarecrow with your arms hanging down. What you do is you are able then to see the entire body, both legs, the torso, both arms, and sometimes the head. Most times the head is turned to the side, so you get that profile of the nose and the lips and the chin. And that's called a composite view. And what that does is that forces perspective. It forces the viewer to be able to see the entire body. And that's what we have here. We have these legs this way, the torso sort of turned towards us, but then the arms in that weird position, and then what we assume is profile here. And so it's really important that we pay attention to the way that they're trying to express movement. We also see that there are lots of dots on the form of the woman, separate from the dots here that imply rain. And you see these dots here. We believe that these are early markings on humans, paint for ritual purposes or war paint. People hate the idea of war paint because that always assumes that there is some sort of war or conflict. But when you say that, then people get the idea of like marking yourselves with dirt or things like that. And that's what we think this might be. Or it could be scarification. But again, because these are prehistoric people with no written language, we're not sure what that is. We also are interested to see that there are some headless figures here. But remember, these are older, and this is the more important figure that comes up over top of it. And so what we're left with is the idea that these people were mostly somewhat stationary, a little bit nomadic in that down by the river in the wet season and up in the plateaus and the caves during the hot season. And that what we see here are early dark humanoid figures. We have the concept of a possibility of doing some sort of ritual with animal bones and grass in order to bring rain. And so these are really important early human depictions. And and if you're wondering where Algeria is, so we're dealing with up here on that coast of the Mediterranean. And when we look at it, it does seem to set us apart from our Southern African friends that will make also really cool stuff. As you're thinking about filling out your 9 block, you're going to want to think about what do you want to see or point out about this if this is what you choose to do. And remember that you want to always look at your theme. So your theme here is masks or headdresses. You could also do a theme of composite body shape. And you could also do painting with pigment. We will see many other places where we paint with pigment. And so what we're really looking for here is to think about how this area of the world was impacted by climate. And we want to think about those early depictions of human forms. Okay, so this is a running horned woman. That then brings us to one of my favorites of all time, which is Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is a much misunderstood piece of architectural coolness. I know that seems, like it's just too simple, but that's really what it is. It's amazingly cool. And what you're looking at here is, this is the 8th one on their list of objects, but remember, sometimes I teach them out of order. So this is in Wiltshire, England. This is Neolithic. So we've entered the new Stone Age, 2500 BCE to 1600 BCE. It's about the same time as the pyramids are being built in Egypt. So we have that. So we're still prehistoric here in England. We are already in the ancient Egyptian literate time period in Egypt. So we want to look at a few things. It's all made out of sandstone and bluestone. The circle itself is a diameter of 108 feet, and the tallest stones are 24 feet high. Now, this was begun in 30,000 BCE, but was not actually completed in its final form until about 1600 BCE. So it underwent different phases of construction between 3000 BCE to 1600 BCE. So there are so many things to talk about and so many things to think about when you think about Stonehenge. The first thing is, this is only one of your images. This gives you a really great image of this construction here, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It also gives you a really great view of the fact that some of the stones are on the ground, and it gives you a concept, like there are some people, of how big this is. But then we go to our next image, and this is your second image. And this is what Stonehenge looks like from above. And so what you can see is the outer circle, there's a section here that is still intact. There are some here that have tipped over. And the inner circle, there are some that are intact and some that have tipped over. And what's really important is that we think about how this was constructed. So we have a couple of things to talk about when we talk about Stonehenge. And let me just show you where Stonehenge is. Sorry. So this is a wider angle of an aerial, and this is really cool. This outside circle here, we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll also talk about this path in a minute, and these stones here. This is a really great shot of the standing stones. But let's look at where Stonehenge is. It's right here, sort of near the southern coast of England. It's a huge complex, okay? And we have lots of cool things to look at. So there is a henge is basically a place with a ditch. And so this is a henge. And so here's your ditch. Here, there's your henge. And there are these really cool things called aubrey holes. There are these holes where they believe there would have been wood pieces, and they have been able to identify those. And the reason that they've been able to identify those is because here's the coolest part that most people don't know about, which is down the road a little bit, there was also Woodhenge, which was built in a similar fashion, but instead of being built out of stones, it was built out of wood. And so this is not one of your images, but I like to show it to you because it really gives you an idea of what's going on here. So here's the River Avon, okay, flows right here. This is where Woodhenge is, okay, up here on the River Avon. The River Avon flows down through here. And then there is what we call the ancestral route, which is that path that I showed you that comes up here and into Stonehenge. So there was a definite thinking process behind Woodhenge being right here on the River Avon and Stonehenge being this distance away from the River Avon, because Woodhenge was the land of the living. Okay. And Stonehenge was the land of the dead. And it was believed that there was sort of a seasonal way of honoring those who had died over the course of a year by the families camping at Woodhenge and making ceremonies of the living, and then thinking about the dead, and then making this trek this transformational trek from life till death, where you go up the ancestral hills into the domain of the ancestors to Stonehenge, which is the most important ceremonial section. So when we look at this, one of the things we have to think about is how they're built. And so this is how you keep these together. This is a shot from below, these tall stones. This is how they're held together. There's a little knob at the top, two little knobs, and then the large pieces set down on top of them. So it's really, really cool. These Aubrey holes are where things have been built. We'll come back to that. These are built with this cool mortise and tenon. And so this is what it would have looked like back in the day before there were, roads and things like this. Here's your henge, your pit. Here's your path to the ancestors, and here is your fully constructed Stonehenge. And so this is what it would have looked like in ancient times. So we're going to come back to this, and we're going to look at this piece for a minute. So this is what Stonehenge probably would have looked like around 1550 BCE. It doesn't have an E there, but BCE. And I want you to look at a couple of things. I want you to look at these two pieces here. I want you to look at the way the path comes so that you pass through these two pieces here, and then in through here, and then across here. And the reason for that is because so there's this entrance here up the path. It's called the avenue. There are these little single stones, then the two stones, and then you come in here through here. And what I need you to understand is that it's so cool. I can't express to you how cool it is. This path from the causeway here through these two stones that would have been there and in through the center, that lines up perfectly with sunrise in the summer solstice and sunset on the winter solstice. So on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, the sun rises between those stones and between these stones to be perfectly framed by this heel stone, these two stones, this arch here, and this arch here. And the sun perfectly rises in that area on the summer solstice. And then on the winter solstice, the shortest night of the year, the shortest day of the year, the sun sets visible through these. It's wild. So what you're looking at is a seasonal and astronomical calendar. It's a calendar. Why do we need to have a calendar to tell time? Well, because we're in the Neolithic period here, but we need to be able to tell time because it allows Neolithic humans, prehistoric humans, to interpret their environment, to understand their environment and weather, and to have the concept of when to plant and harvest and things like that. Because this is such a process, this exterior circle first, the henge was built first, the bank and the ditch. And what happens is that we begin over time to, these pieces begin to evolve and evolve and evolve and evolve. And so these stones are brought, these large stones, I'm going to go back to this photo here. This photo here. The larger stones are sandstone. They are, the tallest one is 24 feet high. They weigh 45 tons, and they're local. They're local sandstone. They were brought down on the River Avon and brought in from the River Avon. Now, let's talk about this. This is before the wheel. This is before the invention of metal tools. So you're talking about people who brought in these giant sarsen stones. That's what they're called. We call them the sarsen stones. We brought in these giant sarsen stones. And how did we bring them in when there were no wheels, no carts, and how did we shape them when we didn't have metal tools? Well, that's an excellent question. How were they moved? there are four basic ideas. One, they were put on logs, and you would lay them down. You'd bring them up the river. No matter how it does, you'd bring them up the river Avon. You'd tip them off how you bring them up the river Avon, and you would lay them on logs. And then as you would have men pull, they would sort of skate along the logs. And when it came off, the back came off the last log, you would bring that log up to the front, and it would now be the front log. And you would just keep moving these logs. So that's one. Okay. Two is that they would go onto like a sled, a big wood platform that you made, and the sled would ride on those rollers. Three is that they were wrapped in branches and basically pushed. And four, a new theory which is coming about is that they were basically pushed on stone ball bearings. There have been all these perfectly round stones that were clearly chiseled out to be perfectly round. There are all these perfectly round stones, and they believed that they would have used them as basically ball bearings. They would have put a bunch of stones, round stones, underneath this big giant thing, and they would have pushed them, and that would have allowed the piece to move. Now that's cool because these big tall ones are from I'm just trying to get to these big tall ones are from local nearby places. However, the smaller ones, these smaller ones inside, okay, they are made out of bluestone, often called dolerite. They weigh depending on which one, between 2 and 5 tons. So between 4 and 10,000 pounds. And what you're talking about is those blue stones, these little short blue stones, came from Wales. And that is another country that is 150 miles away from Stonehenge. So those little blue stones were transported 150 miles, okay, and then brought from the River Avon. This is a big deal. These people clearly believed that whatever they were constructing here was absolutely critical. It had to have been ceremonial. It had to have been important both seasonally and astronomically, but there must have been a ceremonial aspect to it because you just simply do not bring all of these blue stones from 150 miles away without a purpose for them. Okay. And so that's one. And even once you got them to the river, there's then still this elevation that's up on a hill. And so what you're looking at is all these blue stones here were all brought from Wales. Okay. The sarsen stones, the big stones, were brought from a local quarry. And so those are more local, but still those are giant. Those are 45 tons. Those are 90,000 pounds. And so when we're looking at this, we're first impressed by the construction. Then we're impressed by the effort. Okay. Then we're impressed by how did they do this without metal tools? Well, when you bang stone against stone, you can get stone to break the way you want it to. But think about how purposeful they must have been to be able to make these knobs, these mortise and tenon joints here. And then we have to talk about the idea that we're dealing with a people who moved these sarsen stones, the big ones, 25 miles, and these blue ones 150 miles. And so it's critical that we have to think about what is the purpose of this. And so we know because of the alignment of the summer solstice and the winter solstice, we know that there had to have been a really key important piece to the seasons. This is called the slaughter stone, and while there's no evidence that there was actually any human sacrifice done here, there are the remains of 63 specific people, remains found in each of these little red aubrey holes, remains of 63 people, all male, all within the ages of 24 to 40. Okay, so no children, no women. So we know that there's some sort of specificity to who they chose to put in those holes. And there had to have been an importance because remember, this ditch was built first, then these Aubrey holes, then the bluestones, then the Sarsens. So we're dealing with a really important archaeological archaeological place. We're dealing with there are the concept of serious math going on in here. This is perfectly set up to be an astronomical way of looking at the seasons. We also know that some of these stones were moved. The blue stones start on the outside of the circle, but then once we bring in the big sarsen stones, they move to the inside of the circle. So something happens to convince these early constructors of Stonehenge to move those stones from outside, and you can see these little ditches where the blue stones had originally been, to inside. And so we're not exactly sure. This is, again, we're dealing with prehistoric. There's no written record. We do know that, this entrance here is important. We do know that these two pieces were definitely there. We do know that there is a stone that sits right here in the center of them that tells you where to stand to see all of these things. We also know that throughout England, there are more than 1,000 stone circles like this. So we know that these are not a people that did this independently and this was the only one that was ever done. There's definitely a thing that was built. And we know that in most of those places where there is a stone circle, there was also a wood circle. So we have Stonehenge and Woodhenge. And so we know that this idea of these human remains and things like that, those are important. And then here's where I give you the talk about archaeology and how it has changed and how it's important. These Aubrey holes, these little places where they found human remains, they were found in 1920. And because they were found in 1920, archaeology is still very young. What they did was they gathered all of the human remains and just put them into one big pile. And so the human remains have been excavated again, and they've been able to take them and separate them into 63 distinct humans. But the problem is that when you do things like that, you lose the archaeological record and you lose what body was this and where was it located and what was it found with, because we've talked about grave goods and the importance of grave goods. And one of the things that we discuss when we talk about grave goods is that gives us some insight into people. We wonder if, the Venus of Willendorf, she was a grave good, probably. We now talk about grave goods here. Some of these bodies were buried with items that clearly can be traced to Denmark, to Greece, to Italy, and to Germany. Okay. And so we know that some of the bodies that were found here were of people who were born in Germany and moved to this area later in life. And you can tell that by the way the bones react to the water that they drink. But we also know that some of these humans that are buried here were born in Stonehenge or around Stonehenge in Wiltshire, moved to Germany, and then returned to Stonehenge. And we can tell that by the way that we can see the way that their bones calcified and things like that. And so we know that this is an important religious place. We know that this is an important astronomical place. I always struggle to remember that astronomical has to do with, the stars and the moon and the sun, and astrological is like, oh my God, I'm an Aries. So I have to remind myself it's astronomical. And we know that the slaughter stone is not really human sacrifice. We know that it is laying down now, which is why it was originally given that title. But it has a high iron content in this stone, and because it's laying down and the rain has gotten to it, the the iron interacting with the rain makes it look red. And so we'll talk again, like we did with our woman of Willendorf, at how the names for things and why we have things will change as we learn more about them. In addition to the human bones, we also have found deer antlers just in the ditch, and just deer antlers, no other deer bones. And then at the exit here, this is called the southern exit. This is purposefully left. This ditch is not here. At the southern exit here, right before you exit, there are aurochs skulls, those big bulls that we saw in Lascaux, aurochs. There are skulls of aurochs that are buried right here. And so we know that this was a site that was incredibly important. And because we are prehistoric, we don't know exactly what happened or why they built it. But we do know that it was built in phases. We do know that some of the stones moved after they were put in. We do know that some of the stones were brought from, 40 miles or 25 miles away, and some of them were brought from 150 miles away. And we do know that there is a definite connection to the Woodhenge that is up the road, and that there are no human bones buried here. So we know that this is an important route to, and we know that they are the same people that were here and here because of the construction. And so one of the cool things about archaeology and anthropology is trying to figure out why things are the way they are and what we can determine about the people based on the things that they constructed. If you ever have the chance to go to Wiltshire and see Stonehenge, I highly recommend it. It is humbling when you are there, when you think to yourself that they created this with no wheels and no metal tools. It's very, very cool. I highly recommend. And then we're going to pause there for today, and we're going to do some of our African pieces in our next recording.